Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is our third episode covering A Memory of Light and covering all of the rest of the stuff from what we talked about last week, including some things that I didn't have time to actually include in that video that I'll, talk about a little bit earlier on in the video today, going all the way up to the last battle. I am now at chapter 37, which of course the space in between those two bookmarks there, everything between those two bookmarks is that one chapter. It's definitely a situation where reading this book, just honestly jumping straight into spoiler-free impressions, this has been a trip because, it's been 600 pages. I've read those 600 pages and it's surprisingly quickly. It's only been about a week, I think only 8 days worth of reading, and I've managed to get through 600 pages, which is a very, very quick pace for me, even considering that Sanderson reads a little bit faster than Jordan, and these pages have less words per page on them than Jordan's entries did. Even considering that fact, 100 pages a day on average basically is no small amount, and it has been a doozy. I've definitely felt like these first 600 pages, I would say that these have been split into basically two acts. I would say the first 200 or so pages were Act 1, and that was basically preparing for the last battle, and then these next 400 pages have been starting the last battle, basically getting into all of the war and all of the battles, everything happening on so many different fronts, so much happening, and yet not being like the very last moments. And then I'm presuming that like these last 300 pages or so are going to be like, finishing the last battle, where you have obviously the chapter that is titled that, even though the last 400 pages have basically been that thing already. You have the final moments, an ultimate last stand for all of the different storylines is what we've come up to, and seeing the way that that is going to finish off is going to be what the rest of this book is about, presumably. So for this week's reading, we're basically going to cover chapters 24 through 36. I spent just about 7 hours reading over, again, just the last 2 days, getting through these 200 pages, and I'm recording this actually the day after that I recorded last week's diary, so that should put in perspective how quickly I'm running through this. And at this point I would almost actually expect to be finished with this book before somewhere around the time the second diary actually releases, which is going to be crazy. But even still, I'm going to be splitting up these videos because of time-related reasons. In total, I've spent about 21 and a half hours reading the book, and the fact that I'm only about 2/3 of the way through, and having spent that time, and again, also having spent that time in only about a week, is actually quite a bit for me, and it's been an experience for sure. Like I said, man, I don't even know what to say here. I guess, like, as we bridge from my spoiler-free impressions, just saying that this book has been so much, as we bridge from here into the spoiler talk section, I will basically tell you that this video is going to be a little bit different than the last couple have been. I'm not going to even be going in order of like storylines and all of the major events happening in the major storylines, because honestly, there's so much movement in these 200 pages that spending the time to try to, get all of the major plot developments and getting all of those details and stuff into quote-unquote separate storylines and then covering them in even a mildly coherent manner seems like pretty much a waste of my time and not really worth doing, actually. So, and you'll see why as we kind of talk about this, and that's because there's 3 major things that are going on in this diary's reading, and that is a massive subversion of some stuff, a lot of ramifications that come from that subversion. There's a sort of quasi-recovery that occurs, and then there's stuff that's going on in Shayol Ghul that basically leads right into the last chapter, some direct development stuff that's going on over in the Blight, specifically as a location, to kind of wrap up what we're talking about in this video. So for this diary, I don't even have notes up. The last couple I've had notes with all of the stuff going on, all the major events to really cover. Today I don't even have major events to cover. I just have these three general things, these general areas of discussion to get into. So I don't know how long this diary is going to be. I don't know what I'm actually really going to talk about for the most part. I'm probably going to be very brief. I don't feel like I actually need to get into the actual events, the beat by beats of any of these storylines for the most part. There's a handful of moments that I'll call out as relevant, but for the most part, I just want to address a couple of the things that I hinted at last week to start the video, and then I'll get into what this week's reading was actually composed of in that pretty general manner. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Starting off with addressing some topics from last week. These topics actually go directly into talking about what we covered in this week's reading, and that's because there was this week's reading that gave me a little bit of insight into some of the points that I made last week. Notably, I put a little asterisk, a little imaginary asterisk next to 2 points that I talked about in the last diary. The first one of those was about Graendal having gone in to haunt Davram Bashir's dreams, Lanfear telling Perrin in the wolf dream when Perrin, had a little bit of a skirmish with Graendal and Graendal escaped into a nightmare world. Lanfear revealed to Perrin that it was Davram Bashir's dreams that Graendal went into. And of course, we also had a hint that I had talked about last week that seemed relevant to this specific point because Commander Agelmar from the Tarwin's Gap storyline, what's going on in Shayol Ghul, that whole situation has been a little bit off. We got to experience a scene where Agelmar is making mistakes that a commander of his note, that a great captain like him probably shouldn't be making, and despite being tired and that being a reasonable excuse for it, there are people who are suspicious of Agelmar and his handling of the battle and of the retreats and everything going on in Tarwin's Gap, and it eventually becomes so suspicious that in this week's reading, he is directly confronted about it. At the same time, Agelmar is not the only great captain that is having some of these things happen to. That is because there is a massive subversion going on. This is talking about this week's reading. This is the subversion section. Graendal, as we were hinted at in last week's reading, having gone in to haunt Davram Bashir's dreams, as we get to see with a development from him during the Caemlyn front of the storyline, pretty similar to Agelmar. Bashir seems to be making decisions, or rather his quote-unquote anticipations of what's going to happen, his plans, despite seeming completely reasonable, based off of how things are going and some certain seeming subversions of what's going on alongside with the movements of the Trollocs and the Caemlyn/Carrion front of the war. You get to be certain characters become suspicious of Bashir now because similar things are happening up in Tarwin's Gap, where it's certain mistakes are being made that are no, these aren't the kind of mistakes that this person would make. There's probably something seriously wrong here, and so Elaine goes to confront Bashir about it. And this is where we figure out, and this is why I had that revelation last week. I was thinking, wait a minute, Graendal invades Bashir's dreams, and having recorded that last diary, I had just read a chapter where it turned out that Bashir was being accused of being a dark friend, and I had actually had an immediate reaction to that revelation. That revelation was from this week's reading. I went and messaged one of my friends. I was like, man, I'm actually really starting to sympathize with all the people who complain about everybody being dark friends, because Bashir being a dark friend is actually stupid. It makes no sense. Turns out I was jumping the gun a little bit, because when I recorded that last diary, I realized it was wait a minute, Graendal haunted Bashir's dreams. Bashir is now being accused of being a dark friend and, had massive subversion techniques going on in Elaine's army that basically guarantees their destruction. There was a similar thing going on with Agelmar that we had hinted at us last week. And, with Graendal being the one to haunt dreams, and of course Graendal is known for compulsion and stuff like that. Her going in and doing something, meddling with the great captains, seemed like, wait a minute, she's probably the one doing this. Bashir's probably not actually a dark friend. Graendal is just doing some form of conversion, was my thoughts that I had last week. I was like, that's got to be what's actually going on. It turns out it hasn't been directly confirmed, but that's basically what's actually going on. The subversion of this week's reading is that Agelmar and Mashir and Iturralde, all of the great captains, who's the other one? Gareth Bryan in Kandor as well. This was also something that we started to notice, was that what we start to notice with Bryan happens in this week's reading. That wasn't even happening in anything that happened last week, because Bryan didn't even have any major mistakes from last week. I mean, you could maybe argue that the being allowed to be jumped by the Sharans was something of that kind of caliber of mistake from Bryan, but that could also be argued otherwise. So may or may not have been evidence with Bryan back then. But throughout this week's reading, throughout the first half of the reading anyway, we come to points where all four of these great captains are confirmed to be, what's the term that I'm looking for? They are compromised. They are indeed compromised, and it is a very lucky thing that all of these armies have not been utterly destroyed. They are still not in good shape. The Borderlanders in Tarwin's Gap, for example, have lost 2/3 of their men, for example. So that's not good. Of course, the fronts in Kandor could have gone a lot worse, but it also still didn't go very well. The reason why it could have gone worse is because, of course, we talked about last week about how Rand was able to get an agreement between the Shan-Chan and himself, obviously, everybody else, and basically sends the Shan-Chan up in Kandor to aid the Aes Sedai, and they aid the Aes Sedai there, especially now that the Sharans made their mark and did some pretty heavy damage over there. There were some, agreements that had to be made between. This is one particular scene that I will note here. There were some agreements that had to be made between Egwene and Tuon. There was very tense political drama that was going on between them. This is also where we get a moment where, the information that Egwene is getting from Lyowen finally starts to take hold here, where Egwene actually seems to presumably uses the information she learns from Lyowen to, try to subvert Tuon, because she actually makes an argument that Tuon could learn the channel and tries to challenge Tuon to putting on an Adom in order to be controlled, to prove that because she had at one point been Soldom and could therefore train Damane, that Tuon herself could technically be Damane. And so there's some political tensions going on there. That specific element hasn't really been explored further quite yet, but we know that Tuon basically knows now that, or has a little inkling, has been told that this is a concern. So that's interesting. But anyway, moving back to the broader scope of what's going on here, there were some agreements that had to be made between Tuon and Egwene to allow for some things to happen, their agreements. So it's actually surprisingly similar to Egwene's agreements that she had, I think, in the last book or something like that, with the Sea Folk and with the Aiel, where, the White Tower and the Sea Folk and the Aiel would have to trade women channelers with each other to learn from each other's cultures and the different specialties of their forms of channeling, and furthermore those women would be able to decide which culture they would want to be a part of after having been able to experience all of those things. Egwene had to make a similar agreement with Tuon here that if there were women channelers who wanted to be chained up basically by the Shanshan, that they would have to be allowed to do so. And Egwene also insists that if there's anybody who wants to be freed, if there are any Damane who don't want to be Damane, or don't want to be part of the Shanshan culture, that they should also be allowed to leave. So they do come to that agreement. That's interesting to note. So we have a lot of like dynamic between these people. It makes me wonder how that's going to work with the Sea Folk and the Aiel, someday in the future. That's all like post-series stuff, presumably. But, that's worthy of noting. But in either case, the Shanshan do go and actually help the Aes Sedai over in the Kandori front. And something that's notable is that because Matt is part of the Shanshan now, and he's basically one of their generals, it eventually just comes to being where he's the one that notices that Brian's plans are messed up, and that he's basically leading the Aes Sedai armies to destruction. And that if something doesn't happen immediately, it's going to be bad. And he's able to actually get word sent to Egwene to allow for him to basically take hold of all of the armies. There was the moment in the scene where the women, the Sitters of the Hall and Egwene collectively go and question Gareth Bryne, where Egwene seemed to flip in like an instant from like very heavily doubting Gareth Bryne to like seeming to know information that she had not actually been told yet. So there was a little bit of weirdness there in that scene that I'm not sure about, but it's just another one of those scenes where the great captain was questioned. It's determined that they're compromised. And so the Aes Sedai are like, yeah, well, all of Brian's specific captains could probably be compromised in the same way. If this is compulsion or something like that, who's to say that all of his subordinates or his direct subordinates aren't also compromised, anticipating in case he was, figured out. You don't want the Shadow to be able to still influence the armies through his captains, and so command of all of the Shanshan and all of the Aes Sedai armies is given to Matt. And that's also worthy of note, because, well, let's shift a tiny bit of focus here. We know now that the 4 captains are compromised, right? 3 of them have been dealt with, basically. So Egomar's been arrested by Lan, and basically the Borderlanders have determined that Tarwin's Gap is impossible to hold at this front. The Carrion front of the battle with Elaine and Bashir and all of them, Bashir's been arrested, and Elaine, I forget like who actually takes proper control over there. Oh yeah, that's right. That's because it is a very desperate situation on the Carrion front of the war, because there are 2 groups of Trollocs that are like hemming them in near the walls of Carrion, where Elaine's army tried to defeat the one force and then turned right back around to try to defeat the other one right as they showed up. And like, it could have worked if they had more time, but again, the subversion, Bashir being compromised, meant that the timing of things were off, so it wasn't actually going to work. And so Elaine is like in this last desperate attempt of like, all of my people are going to die, what is actually going to happen? But then the Black Tower shows up, and they say that they are in direct support of Caemlyn, direct support of the Crown of Andor, which is a good thing. So they actually help Elaine out of a bind. Androl gets a nice moment to shine here, where he's able to link up with like 14 other people, basically 14 other men and women, or 13 other men and women, I forget, but he's in a very large circle, and he's the one in command of it, which actually confuses Elaine at first, until he uses a ginormous gateway to basically be the surprise jump front that is able to hem in the Trollocs, the remaining Trollocs that are just about to defeat Elaine's army. I think he opens the other side of the gateway into Dragonmount itself, actually, and uses lava, basically, to force the Trollocs back enough to allow Elaine's army enough time to recover and group up to actually defeat the forces, and that is able to be successful in that way. So the Tarwin's Gap front is basically needing to be abandoned, and the Carrion front is basically clean now. Elaine was able to get through all of that, and so the Kandori front, we also have the issue of the Sharans still, and trying to survive there. With the Shanshan, it's a little bit better. Now that Matt's in charge, things are going a little bit better, but these people are able to actually come together and have a meeting and determine, hey, At this point, Matt basically is able to talk with Elaine and Egwene. They're able to do, some traveling and gateway stuff to allow them all to meet and actually talk with one another. Also with the Sitters of the Hall, because they actually command the Aes Sedai armies. But in either case, Matt basically asserts and tells them all, it's just like, we can't afford to be fighting a multi-front war at this point. Elaine's armies are good, like they dealt with what they really needed to deal with down south, but Tarwin's Gap needs to be abandoned and Kandor basically needs to be abandoned. We are in a position because of Gareth Bryne's positioning and his being compromised. Even the Kandori front is in a bad position now too, that can't actually be held very well. So Matt's like, we need a new battlefront that is close, that will attract both the Shayanaran front of the war and the Kandori front of the war, because the southern front is basically dealt with now, where we collectively, the three of our armies, the Borderlanders and the Aes Sedai and Elaine, everybody else, can group together and make one final stand. They determined that the field of Marilor, which is there right at the border of Shienar and Arafel, is the place to make that final stand, so that all the Trollocs coming from the Tarwin's Gap front are going to be attracted to that location. All the Trollocs and everybody from the Kandori front are going to be attracted to that location because it's close by. It's a good location for Matt to actually be able to lead the forces against, to be able to hold, because that is their job, is to just hold the war until Rand wins. Although actually Matt does go ahead and make a point. It's like, no, we can't just hold the battle. We have to defeat all of the Trollocs, so we need to be in a location for that to happen. That's part of why he asserts the armies needing to come together, and so they actually make that organization, and so that's a decision that they make. The recovery period of the week's reading was basically all of these things being determined, determining that the great captains are compromised, dealing with them, and centralizing all the forces to make the final stand. So now everybody's basically ready to make said final stand in the Field of Marilor for this last battle chapters. So that's basically what's going on those three major war fronts. But you'll notice that there's four great captains, and I have mentioned it through all day, but I haven't talked about him in the context of everybody else because, well, the front of the war in Shayol Ghul is actually a little bit separate. That's why I wanted to talk about Shayol Ghul technically a little bit separately in this video, is because there are a few other points of things that are going on, major events in the book that are more or less centralized to Shayol Ghul. So one of those things is that, of course, we actually, once it is determined among the other three fronts of the war that the other great captains are compromised, that we get the direct confirmation that there is something wrong in the minds, that there is something messing with the minds of the generals, of the captains, by having an Iturralde POV. This is actually something that we get to experience from the other great captains who are arrested, is like once it is directly brought up to them, once they are confronted about their mistakes and everything like that, they come to realize for the most part. I don't know if Egomar does, but like Bryne and Bashir both have moments. Actually, I don't remember. I know Bryne does. In either case, we have moments where their great captains try to resist the fact that they're being called out. They're trying to insist that things are just mistakes, but then they come to a certain point where they snap the other direction, and it's like, oh no, I realize like how much wrong I've done. And they also seem to have a little, an air of regret, like knowing that they were doing the wrong things, but they weren't able to actually not do the wrong things. It's like something was controlling them. It's like something was compelling them basically to do the wrong things. I think Bryne breaks down once he's able to come to this point and basically has a self-realization, a self-deprecating moment of, it's like I knew that all of these things were mistakes, but I couldn't stop myself from doing them, or it's just all of the wrong ideas came to my head. I don't know what's wrong with me. These kinds of sentiments. Once we have an Iturralde POV following all the other great captains being dealt with, I think all the other captains are dealt with at this point. the ordering doesn't really matter. In either case, at Thoralde, we get a POV from him where he actually like mentally has to resist the bad ideas, and we get to experience that in a way of like him having to resist giving orders that he knows are stupid and bad. It's just like, wait, why is this thought even coming to my mind? And he's able to resist giving those orders. So up to a point in Shayol Ghul, that army is not dealing with the compromisation of Lord of Thoralde quite the same way that the other battlefronts are dealing with the compromisation, because it is Thoralde who is able to resist that, and it is in the final moments where he stops resisting it, or where he is unable to resist it all the way, where he wants to tell his great captains, like, take over for me, something is wrong with me, I keep trying to give suggestions that I know are stupid, but he's like unable to actually say that. So this is where we get like basically the confirmation that there is some form of compulsion involved. And we also have a scene a little bit earlier with Perrin, because a lot of what Perrin's doing in the Wolf Dream is just trying to find Slayer, basically, and at multiple points having to go back to the Blight to stop Slayer from being able to attack Rand. Of course, we'll talk a slight bit more about Perrin in just a moment, but in one of the times when Perrin actually goes back and battles Slayer a little bit briefly, he does have an encounter with, who is it that he has an encounter with? I think maybe it's not that he has an encounter with anybody. I forget the exact details, but Perrin comes to the realization that the great captains are being controlled, that there are issues with some of the great captains, and so basically gives advice to other people. Like, he tries to tell his wolf friends and whatnot, like, figure out some way basically for Lord of Thoralde to be taken care of, so that he can't actually do anything bad, because he's probably compromised. Like I said, I forget the details. I probably horrifically brutalized what actually occurred in that scene, but because of that scene, it is when we have the Thoralde POV, when he's just about to give bad orders, when wolves actually come and like knock him out and like take him away basically, and he like in his head thanks the wolves for doing that, for stopping him from being able to give orders that he doesn't want to give, that he doesn't intend to give, that he never thought were a good idea. So Thoralde is technically taken care of without that entire battlefront being lost, which is a really good thing. The problem is that Shayol Ghul has some other problems going on, and one of those is that male Aiel who are channelers are around. So in the Aiel culture, this is something that is like confirmed for us directly by like Avienda POVs, for example. There are male Aiel channelers. Whenever they are discovered, they are basically sent to the Blight to go fight the Dark One. It's basic. That's their death sentence for male channelers, or at least that was their death sentence for male channelers as a result of the taint and all of that. And so it turns out that these channelers have basically been being turned to the Dark One in the Blight, and that these non-Aiel, we call them red veils because they wear red veils instead of black, I think. I think normal Aiel wear black. In either case, they're called red veils in the book. That's how, like, Avienda refers to them, as easy sauce. They start actually infiltrating the camp of what's going on in Shayol Ghul. So you have some of them and some of the other dreadlords that are actually starting to make moves inside the camp. So even though Thoralde's being compromised doesn't seem to have actually done any active bad for the people over here, there are other problems that they have to deal with, that they actually have to combat and go against, that start to become problems. And what actually happens with all of that, who knows, man. We'll figure it out next week's diary, I guess. But yeah, it's very tense material. It's very engaging material as well, and also very lore rich, I guess, to some extent, because you're actually getting some information about some things about the Aiel that like have hitherto been, basically irrelevant, and it's like, oh, so that's an actual Chekhov's gun situation where it's like, oh yeah, they send male Aiels to the Blight to fight the Dark One. It's their death sentence, but it turns out no, they're not dying. They're just being turned to the Dark One and guarding the prison. So yeah, that front is going both poorly and well. The other problem that's going on in Shayol Ghul right now is that Rand is still fighting Moradin with, at the boar, basically, in the pits of doom here, and Nynaeve and Moraine are with them. And Slayer is still trying to find some way to get in there to actually, hunt Rand like he's been commanded to do. And, he and Perrin have another skirmish. Perrin is unfortunately injured, so that's really not good. Perrin ends up getting injured and has to, wait in the fields of Marilor in the Wolf Dream for a gateway to be open so that he can be saved, and eventually happens, basically. So that's good, but what happens with Perrin from this point on, I'm not entirely sure of. Therefore, Slayer also technically has free access to Rand outside of, the wolves, who are still going to try to stop him whenever he tries to arrive at the Blight to do anything. So there's major concerns with what's going on there. Perrin wasn't able to actually do anything about getting to Graendal. Lanfear is also pretty disappointed in Perrin for getting injured, so what's actually going on with all the Forsaken is really sketch. Of course, I mentioned Rand actively battling Moradin and happens to touch the Dark One's essence in there, and so he's locked in a form of combat, some form of how do you even describe it? Some form of metaphysical combat with the Dark One is what it seems like he's got himself engaged with in there, where he and Moradin are actually frozen, fighting each other. They were combating, but they're frozen in position. And Nynaeve and Moraine can't really do anything about it. And so, that's something that will be interesting to follow. Another interesting note is that Rand has actually only been in the cave here in the Pits of Doom for about an hour at this point, whereas, days or weeks have gone by elsewhere. So, again, the time funkiness happening, the closer you get to the Dark One, is stuff that's affecting the battle actively, and the war front in Shayol Ghul is literally just hold off until Rand comes out, basically. And so the fact that he's only been in there for an hour to him, but it's been weeks or something outside, is not fantastic. But in any case, I guess the last really notable thing that happens in Shayol Ghul here for this week's reading is that Nynaeve determines hey, if Rand and Moradin are frozen in this combat with each other, what if I try to push or hurt Moradin to some extent while these two are in this sort of combat? What if something like that happens? Unfortunately, they're having to combat a weird wind that's trying to suck them into the Dark One's essence, the wall of blackness, whatever that's going on in the cave. And so Nynaeve can't just go towards that directly, so she tries shimmying around the cave a little bit, using the stalactites and stalagmites to move around a bit to avoid being sucked into the darkness, because she doesn't want that, of course, and also to just try to see if she can do something for against Moradin, for example, to try to help Rand. But it turns out there's been another person in the cave this entire time that we didn't know about. Remember that one Aes Sedai who bonded Rand against his permission 1.5 million years ago, named Alana, and how she has not really been a character in the series for a while, just a couple of references, I think, in the last couple of books, where Rand determined that she was somewhere distant off north. Who knows what she's doing? I forgot all about her, and it turns out that her being somewhere distant out north somewhere was probably her having been captured by the Forsaken, by Moradin specifically, being in the Pits of Doom here, and that, well, let's put it this way. Alana has been stabbed by Moradin, or at least that's what Nynaeve determines has happened, because somehow I guess Moradin knows that Alana had bonded Rand. Rand, being one of Alana's warders in this case, means that if Alana dies, Rand presumably goes into the madness, the rage, the craziness that happens to warders when their Aes Sedai dies. And so apparently it seems like it is implied that right before this confrontation, right before this battle, right before Rand came down here, Alanna was stabbed, so that she will eventually like bleed out and die while Moradin and Rand are in conflict. And what that does to Rand, we'll see if that happens, but Nynaeve notices Alanna while she's moving about the room. It's like, wait a minute, there's another woman here. What's going on here? This is Alanna. Oh no, she was the one who bonded Rand, and she is bleeding out actively. But Nynaeve can't heal her because Nynaeve is linked with Rand, and she can't use her own magic unless Rand gives her power back. And like, she doesn't know if that's possible here. So we're left on this like sort of cliffhanger of like what's actually going on between Rand and Moradin and the Dark One at this point. Who knows? Like I said, it's some weird metaphysical stuff. We only had like a very brief, like 1 or 2 page scene over the course of the week's reading that was there in Rand's POV. And now we also have this other dangling loose end that is actually a very massive problem, and that is that Alanna is bleeding out and presumably dying here, and Nynaeve can't do anything to stop it. And of course, Slayer is still trying to get into the cave to combat Rand, and Perrin is injured and can't really do anything, and everybody else is like just situated at the Field of Marilor. And there's also one other final wrinkle that I have forgotten to mention up to this point, and that is that, remember when Zareen was tasked with finding the Horn of Valir? Well, over in the Fields of Marilor, Egwene and everybody thinks that the Horn of Valir has not been found yet, which distresses Matt a little bit. But the truth is that the Horn of Valir was located in the tower. Zareen was able to get it with, her, transport, her food transports and stuff like that, who were, meant to be like the guys under which she was supposed to find the horn and bring it to Matt, basically. But in transporting the horn and some of the other stuff back to the Fields of Marilor, there was a bubble of evil, or it seems like it was a bubble of evil, goes off, and the Aes Sedai that was opening the gateway to the Field of Marilor apparently opened it to Shayol Ghul, or rather to the Blight instead. So Zareen and whatever people are with her, some 100+ people, I don't even know the count, but she has plenty of people with her. They're transported to the Blight instead, and now they can't go anywhere. All that Egwene and everybody else knows is that there was a residue of the gateway that had been opened that sent them to the Blight, but it was too old, and nobody with the talent to actually read those weave residues were able to actually determine where it went. So the Horn of Valir is now lost in the Blight, and Zareen tries to take all of her people with the horn. They decide to just start going south, because what else are they going to do, except Satel Anan is with them, and she, having been, at one point an Aes Sedai, or having burnt herself out like 25 years ago or something like that, she happens to know and recognize some things about magic and some things that are going on with Blight, and she also knows that Shayol Ghul's right over there to the east, actually. So they start heading over there to the east to hope that Rand's forces will be able to make a gateway to get them back to the Fields of Marilor, where Zareen can actually get the horn taken back to Matt. Unfortunately, once they're pretty close to their target, its would-be thieves are attempting to get the horn now amongst her own camp. Zareen has a problem with this, obviously, and so she tries to hide the horn to try to trick people into trying to take it from the chest that it has been hidden in up to this point, except that they were anticipating that, so they very nearly got the horn, and were chased away. I forget who it was. It was like Vannin and somebody else, like 2 people who were like amongst the upper echelon of this entire force that is stuck in the Blight here, or Dark Friends, and we're trying to get the Horn of Valir. Very nearly did, and there's also a question mark of maybe they did and they could have just replaced it with a replica. Zareen has zero way of knowing one way or the other if that's potentially the case. So they're in a pretty desperate situation too. They're pretty close to the Blight, of course, or to Shayol Ghul, where they might be able to get transported, but there is also the possibility that the horn that she's trying to get back to Matt, that ought to make like probably the last biggest final effective difference in the last battle, maybe the horn isn't even the right horn. Who knows? Maybe the Dark One has it. We don't know at this point. So everything's just basically going wrong. The only plus side is that Matt is leading the armies in the fields of Marilor, and everybody's centralized there, and that isn't going terribly. But yeah, because despite Iturralde not having been able to destroy his own army very well, because he was able to resist that much, there's problems going on with Shayol Ghul. There's all the problems that we just talked about with with Rand, and then there's the problems with the Horn on top of everything else as well. So like, it's just kind of a disaster. And that is basically where the book leaves off for chapter 37, which is the last battle, which is a 190-page chapter by itself. This is a chapter that will take me like 7 or 8 hours to read. It'll be bonkers and crazy to think that I'm at this point too, because like just to reflect on this again, like I did a couple weeks ago in the first diary for the book. It was May 2023 that I read Eye of the World. It is, the middle of April 2026. It has been 3 years that I've been reading this series, and I am now on the last battle. I'm now in the last 300 pages of the book. A case of there's only 300 pages left, and there's still 300 pages left. I don't know how to feel. I'm stressed out about the book, we shall say. And unfortunately, try as I might, I really, really, really wanted to be able to read the last battle chapter all in one sitting. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think next week's diary as well is going to be a little bit different. I'm betting that next week's diary is going to be a collection of like 3 or 4 smaller videos, because what I'm probably going to do over the next 3 or 4 days before I have to go on a business trip, I'm going to, split out the last battle over a handful of days, because there's time-related stuff that's not going to allow me to read it all in one sitting, and I'm not even going to be able to read it all in like 2 days or anything. I'll probably even potentially be lucky to get it read in 3 or 4 days, so I'm going to try to get through the last battle in the next 3 or 4 days. What I'm probably going to do is I'm going to record a video sort of along these lines that's just me rambling, yapping about what I read that morning, and do that for all 3 or 4 mornings that it takes me to read the chapter. Then I'll stitch those together at the end of the process and make that next week's diary after the fact. And then I'll have the 5th and final diary, presumably about the last 100 pages. We'll see how I decide to split that. I've had people tell me that it's hard to split the last battle from the last 100 pages, that it's best to just read it and then figure out where to split from there. I'll probably make that determination, because it'll probably take me about a week or so to get through these last 300 pages, and I have enough time in between that reading and actually composing the final diary for me to determine that. We'll see what happens, but so just the next diary or two may be a little bit different than one might anticipate, kind of the way that this one was a little bit different, because really, what was I going to do about plot summaries? Like, I just rambled about general stuff, and it took 45 minutes. It was, this book is going bonkers, and I have no idea how the last battle is going to go. So I guess I'll see you guys next week to tell you how it all went down, and it'll be a doozy. Anyway, I'm going to cut that off and let that be the end of the video. The shortest diary in a very long time, since like before the Gathering Storm at this point. So that's fun. Thank you for watching this. I hope to see you guys in the next diary next week, just to see how the last battle goes. I am stressed out, but for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.